Hi, good day, good morning, good evening, depending where you're listening from, to another episode of On My Own Terms podcast. My name is John and I'm the host of the podcast. So today with me, we have a very special guest. For the first time in this podcast, we have an author in this podcast. So her name is Winnie Wong. She is a business leader, an educator, a researcher, investor, and a philanthropist. She has over a decade of corporate experience working with startups, scale ups, and big tech companies. An advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI in short, in entrepreneurship, Winnie has mentored foreign domestic workers in entrepreneurship and advised social impact funds in granting $1 million to female led startups. She's also a speaker on subjects on women, entrepreneurship, and technology. Winnie holds an MBA from INSEAD, where she was a Forte Fellow and was named a Rising Talent by the Women's Forum for the Economy and Society. A Canadian born Chinese, Winnie has lived in Canada, the United Kingdom, France, China, and Singapore. Outside of her work with entrepreneurs and underprivileged women, Winnie enjoys the outdoors, yoga, and French cooking. Hi, Winnie. Welcome to the show.
Hi, John. Thanks so much for having me on your podcast.
And
How are you
today,
doing?
I'm good. I'm good. As we're recording now, it's 8:17. We're both in Singapore. And just for the audience, this is a re-recording of our conversation because we want to do better for the audience. And today, I think I really want to spend a lot of time talking about your book. But before that, can you tell us a bit about yourself and your background and what brought you to Singapore?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a Canadian born Chinese, and I actually moved to Singapore maybe like back in late 2015. And it's only through writing this book and going through this journey over the last year that I realized why. A big part of it was when I went to my undergrad, I was very lucky in Canada to receive a ton of scholarship money. And so I got to go travel and live and study in French speaking Canada, the United Kingdom, and in China. And I just got to learn so much about life through basically transplanting myself into different cultures. And I just fell in love with Asia, which is why I ended up deciding to move here. After I'd graduated, spent 4 years working before I decided, you know what, it's time for me to take a risk because I've always wanted to live in Asia. And like, I had no mortgage, I had no kids, I had no liabilities, I didn't have to pay off any debts. So I quit my job. I sold a lot of what I had and I just moved to Singapore with a suitcase. Yeah. And I just started looking for a job. I only had one friend here who, fortunately housed me for like 2 weeks or when I first landed here. And that was it. I just, started cold calling people, just networking, really just like reaching out to anyone and telling people my story that, I'm a Canadian. I've lived in China before, but I really want to work in Singapore. Yeah. And through writing this book, I actually learned and my book's called You Don't Have to Look the Part How East Asian Women Thrive as Entrepreneurs. Through writing this book, I started to understand why did I want to move to Singapore as an Asian minority in a relatively multicultural, like Canada's one of the most multicultural societies in the world, but I still felt like there are systemic barriers in my education, like as an undergraduate student. There was a bit of segregation between, the white kids and the Asian kids. And that was actually the first time I actually felt that kind of segregation. I growing up, it was hyper multicultural. I had friends from Pakistan, from like Serbia, everywhere, but when I went to an elite university in Canada, that's when I started to see this divide. And when I entered the workforce in Canada, I started to look up and notice, even though I live in the most multicultural world and probably the most multicultural city in the entire world, still all the leaders are Caucasian males. And I don't see women getting promoted. And so I didn't think of this at the time, but I realize now when I look back and now that I've lived here in Singapore for so long, that was a major push factor for me. Yeah, so my book actually explores a lot of the barriers towards women as well as East Asians. And so as an East Asian woman, a double minority, I was facing a lot of these. And they do still exist in Asia to some extent. If you work, if you look up, there's actually a lot of foreigners who end up taking senior leadership roles. They get transferred from other parts of the world to take on these senior leadership roles rather than being developed within Asia. So, it doesn't just apply to the Western world, but it also applies to the Eastern world. And going through this writing journey, I've really learned a lot about, these type of systemic barriers and this double whammy, I would say, of the bamboo ceiling of being Asian, as well as, the glass ceiling of being a woman.
Cool. Yeah, I was gonna ask you to tell us the title of the book, so I'm glad you did. Yeah, and what you said earlier, and that's how you've been. I mean, that's how you felt, and then you wrote the book. And tell us how you got started in writing the book. Was this well, because you can choose other mediums, and what made you decide to embark on a writing journey? And I mean, as we discussed earlier, it's not been easy. It's been quite a while. Tell the audience why you chose to embark on this writing journey.
Yeah. So in terms of why did I decide to write a book to begin with was I had been laid off from a job like, for some time and I actually really hated working there at that place. It just wasn't the right fit for me, honestly, and I don't blame anyone for it. It just wasn't the right fit. And looking back, I feel like it was meant to happen. And because of that, I took time off of, the corporate world. And I just, traveled, I went hiking, I did a meditation course. You do all these things that you've always wanted to do, but you've always made excuses that I always made excuses not to do. So I thought about, during this time, what are some of my retirement dreams? Like, what would make life meaningful for me? And so one of those things was, teaching, which I actually got into as well. I started teaching MBA students as well as writing a book. I knew that this was a lifelong dream. I've always wanted to write a book. And I think that's something that resonates with many people as I share this story with them too. So I had, spoken to so many people just doing research about, how do I self-publish or, how do I get into writing? And I fell across, I was speaking to a friend of a friend. I've spoken to people who had book deals. I've spoken to people who had gone through the self-publishing journey. And I spoke to a friend of a friend who had gone through this writing program that was started by a Georgetown professor. So for 5 months, I would take a course for 1 hour a week to learn about how to write a book. And I would also get the support of a developmental editor 1 hour a week. I'd chat with them and they would go and read through everything that I was writing. And they really taught me. It was so different from what I was expecting a book writing journey to be like. In the book writing journey, there's like this convergence and divergence of thought. So, divergence is first, you need to create all these data points. And that's in the phase of collecting stories. You're writing various mini stories or plot lines around a topic generally. And you have no idea where your book's going to land. But then over time, you start to refine your scope of the stories that you're looking for or you're writing about. And then they start to converge and you see all these patterns. So for me, I chose to write about East Asian women in entrepreneurship because I've been working with, a nonprofit for the last 7 years, supporting East Asian foreign domestic helpers in their entrepreneurship journey so that, they don't go home after 40 years working in Singapore to go back to a family that's still impoverished. They're learning how to save money, they're able to invest in productive assets and then go home within something like 12 years, which is a big difference. Actually able to see your kids, grow up. They're not being raised by, other family members. So because of that, I really got into entrepreneurship, like working with entrepreneurs. And that's something that I've always noticed. I volunteer heavily in women, entrepreneurship, and technology. So that's how I dug into that. And as I interviewed and profiled many founders, female founders, I realized that every culture faces their own issues. And I didn't feel like I could speak or represent the voices of, Hispanic women or African American women or Serbian women as well as I could for East Asian women. So I really narrowed down the focus. And that's how I ended up writing this book about East Asian women and connecting it with my own journey as an East Asian woman working in Canada as well as Singapore now. But also, I realized my family's made up of entrepreneurs. So my mother is an entrepreneur. Both of my sisters are entrepreneurs as well. So I'm surrounded by East Asian female entrepreneurs.
And could you give us like a short preview of the book? What are some of the parts of the book that you think the audience of this podcast would enjoy or can relate to?
Yeah. So my book is really about, I think, the sense of urgency behind it and the why it's so important is that women-led startups get only 2% of venture capital funding, even though women own 1 in 3 businesses globally. I just couldn't believe it when I heard that. It's really it reminds me, and I feel like it's a parallel to women's ability to climb or go up the corporate ladder or work their way through up the corporate ladder as well, because similarly, like for we also see this drop off of women as they go up the corporate ladder. So one statistic I have from Lean In and McKinsey 2022 is that for every 109 men that are promoted, 87 women are promoted and 82 women of color are promoted. So it's really clear that there's something going on. There's a lot of whether it's systemic barriers or whether it's something that women face internally, there's something that's causing them to only get 2% of venture capital funding. And so my book really explores that. And it's structured in 3 parts. One part is to really explore, the barriers that these women face and why is that happening exactly. The second part is looking at the common themes that I saw, like customer empathy. The ability to empathize with your customers is huge when you're building a product on your own, or like going through taming your own inner critic. A lot of us, we are our worst enemies internally. And we have to realize that not everyone is thinking what we're thinking in our heads. We think that there's a huge spotlight on us and everyone's staring at us and we're always embarrassed whenever something bad happens to us. But honestly, nobody thinks that much about us and we need to talk to ourselves and rev ourselves up more. And there are other themes like grit or the influence of family that I found were keys to success for how these East Asian female entrepreneurs were able to, become successful entrepreneurs despite all these barriers that East Asian women face today in with getting venture capital funding, getting their pitches through, and building their companies. And then finally, the third part of my book is about solutions, and this is about how can our communities, whether it's governments with supporting childcare, whether it's educators with creating and spotlighting East Asian female entrepreneurs or other minorities actually, as role models, because we often see ourselves as we often see when we think of a firefighter, if we think of a policeman, we'll always think of a man in a police uniform. We never think of a police woman, right? Because we've never seen that or it's not ingrained in us. So that's an example, as well as investors as well. How can they become more diverse? How can they can also remove the biases that they face or the homophily? So homophily is the fact that something like 40% of venture capitalists actually come from 3 MBA schools. One is Harvard, two is Wharton, and three is Stanford. So obviously it's within their networks that they source startups to fund. But if you don't come from these schools, you don't know very much about financing venture capital and you don't have the connections in to be able to pitch to them or get the coaching that you need. So my book goes through also the solutions of how can we better support East Asian female entrepreneurs through increasing diversity in the venture capital space, as well as closing the funding gap and supporting through all these resources.
And why is it why is the book important, right? I know you told us about how you came into writing and you came from a family of Asian female entrepreneurs. And you're writing a book about that. But why is it important?
Yeah, it's important because it's about equality, it's about equity, and it's about inclusion. It's about everyone having the opportunity to pursue their dreams. And that was something that I realized when I moved to Singapore. I came from Canada where the minimum wage is extremely high. So a lot of people don't have the ability to hire foreign domestic help at home. But here in Singapore, we have the luxury of having foreign domestic help. And that actually has helped women a lot in the workforce because typically women take on a higher degree of unpaid care work at home. And when we have this support in our home systems, females feel more supported in having children. They also feel supported at work where they don't have to rush home to pick up their kids as much, or senior leaders do not think, oh, we cannot send her to Taiwan for a week or whatever. They don't take away these opportunities from women and take them out of the running because they understand already inherently that, women can do these things. And I think that's what the purpose of the book is here is also, even if you've never seen anyone do this before, like, this book is about showing you that there have been minorities who have done these things before. They've started their own companies, they've fundraised successfully. And so it's about empowering minorities to believe in themselves and believe that they can do it because it all starts with believing in yourself before to get that idea going. And there's so many studies around how men who pitch, a lot of them, a vast majority of them are way more convincing than females. That's what affects, this 2% only getting venture capital funding. A lot of it is because men are like very confident in it and they're able to, BS their way through things, not all of them, but I mean, it's a common thing that women often don't feel as comfortable with. Women are a bit more risk averse, they're more self critical. So, yeah, that's kind of why I really felt it was so important. With only 2% of venture capital funding going towards women led startups, it's about empowering minorities to understand that they can do it too. And you don't have to look the part.
Yeah, I know when I ask the question, I sound like an ass, right? Like a dick, right? For asking that. I'm not dissing the importance of this subject. I just want to challenge you because it could just be like an angry author, right? Writing about the issues that the ethnicity of the author has been facing all along. So I just wanted to sort of clarify, give you the chance to clarify that. And I was just thinking of another potential reason why this book could be so important because if I look at the lens of an investor, I don't want to miss out on such great opportunities, right? Because I mean, I'm married. I know the power of women, right? I mean, the women are just, I think, in my opinion, such great jugglers of time and priorities. And I think that's also a great factor. And of course, they work, and there's been results shown, right, that companies with females in the board have greater ROIs for the investors, for the stakeholders. So there's been financially proven results. And I think the angle that I'm coming from is that as an investor, I just don't want to, at least this book highlights my blind spots. And I think this book could be important for investors who are really looking to really get a good ROI on their money being as investment, because it's what they do, right, as investors. Yeah, I don't know if you cover this in your book.
Yeah, it's completely true. I have gone through a lot of the research around it where female-led startups raise less than male-led startups. However, they actually have a lot more ROI than male-led startups. And there is still, we aren't sure whether it's because only like, the top of the top of female founders, like the top 2% of female founders are getting the spotlight and versus, the top 80% of founders, right? It's that it could be that, but it could be also their decision making processes. The fact that you said that women juggle a lot, especially as mothers, because they take on a lot more like emotional or mental burden in a lot of, domestic duties. However, traditionally. So, one investor that I talk about in the book, his name is Kevin O'Leary, and he's famous as being one of the judges on the hit reality television series Shark Tank. And so for him, he's invested in many, like he's made his own angel investments in a ton of different companies throughout the many years that he's been on this show. And he says that 75% of his returns come from female led startups. Interestingly enough, he's so supportive of investing in women because he's seen it where the women are a lot more realistic with their targets. And he says that the male led startups, they usually only hit their revenue target 65% of the time versus the female ones hit it 95% of the time. And that really affects how employees feel about the company. If a company's only hitting the target 65% of the time, they don't believe in the vision of the leader anymore. And that causes a lot of high turnover. Versus for a lot of women-led startups, they're a lot more careful about their goal setting. And that's what allows them to motivate their teams and say, this is a realistic goal and hit it so many times. So I think that's like, one example of it that people have shared is that, they do feel like women are a bit more, they're risk averse, but they're also very realistic in their target setting, as well as they're very human as well when they think about things. One of the East Asian female founders that I profile, her name's Vicky Tsai. And so she founded the beauty company called Tatcha. And the reason why is because she'd worked in the global beauty care industry for many years. And she had used her skin, as a testing bed for all these different products. And over time, she had developed dermatitis from using this. So her skin was like super scaly. It was very allergic to basically everything. So she just took time off of work and she traveled throughout Japan, meeting with like monks and different like, beauty healers. And she started to learn the techniques that the Japanese use to treat their skin as well as love themselves. Like it's kind of, a bit of a two-pronged approach where, you kind of have to, how you feel about yourself really affects, how you come off, your energy that you have, your ability to heal yourself. And, stress is actually known to be a very big cause of illness. And so she wanted to bring these teachings to the Western world through the products and the ingredients, as well as combining it with also, love for yourself. And so she started her own business. She sold her engagement ring with the permission of her husband, and she and her husband worked on a company together, this beauty company. They moved into her parents' house, and over 9 years, she really grew this company, from the ground up, from her parents' house, essentially. And all this time, she had hid that she had this really great background in the corporate world, including the fact that she had gone to Harvard Business School for her MBA. However, despite all of this, one of the like when she brought in these private equity investors into her company, they suggested, you know what, Vicky, I think it's time that you get a real CEO. So despite that she, has been running this company, she founded it, she also has an MBA, she's worked in the beauty industry before, and her company's still growing at double digits every single year. They still said, we don't think you look like a CEO. We're going to bring in, a more traditional looking CEO. And you can imagine what that looks like. So they brought him in, and then there was so much high turnover. The company just became a hyper transactional company where they were firing employees, they were introducing very strict performance management, and the employee turnover really caused the company to just get driven down into the ground, and it lost its core values as well about supporting and helping women actually and really caring about them. It just became all about profit, but it wasn't actually working out. The bottom line as was actually dwindling. And because of that, the P company actually had to fire this CEO and go back to Vicky and say, "Hey, like we actually think like we would love for please come back." The company's like, down in the outs now. So she actually came back and then she just went on a listening tour throughout the company when she came back. She just listened to all the employees about what they felt like were the issues. And what we know is that the people who are usually on the ground, the closest to the customers, people who are on, at call centers, people who are interacting in stores, these people often know exactly what the customer wants way more, understands the customer issues way more. And she really listened about everything. And that's how she ended up being able to turn around the company to a level where a couple years later, she sold the company Tatcha to Unilever for $500 million. So I
Tatcha?
think the big thing that, yeah,
Yeah, so
Tatcha.
Tatcha is
Um,
spelled as a Tatcha.
yes, it's like matcha, but with a T. Yeah, so I think through this experiences and a lot of these other stories that I share in the book, actually, like we learn a lot of common themes. The big one, in this one was really how she was able to tame her own inner critic, and she was very not confident in herself and speaking up for herself and fighting for herself, right? But and we often think we're the worst person ever to ourselves, where we say, we're not enough all the time. we're not self-compassionate, and we always think we need to please everyone, but honestly, like, we are doing fine. If you're able to have shelter over your head and clean water that you're able to drink, you're doing fine.
My
So I
my
think that was
my
yeah.
perspective about men and women is that I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I just feel that women sometimes have this, I think it's quite unfair judgment of like how they look. No one's gonna judge how a male CEO looks like, right? I mean, you've got the big white guys, typically from American companies or North American companies, tall, short. I mean, we've got one of the richest companies in China, Alibaba, right, run by Jack Ma, right? No one's gonna say, hey, he doesn't look like a CEO. But I
Mhm.
feel, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, I just feel that female probably has this additional judgment, right, on how they look, how they dress, how they speak. I just feel that they're being treated and judged a bit more harshly. That is not the same for men.
100%. It's actually conditioned from such a young age too, where women are taught, they need to be beautiful, they need to be stoic, they need to be small in that, in many cultures, girls are encouraged to be thin, take up less space, wear high heels, like be as small as possible. They're expected to be soft and differential to others, and they're expected to be passive, that, they need to be gentle and kind, and versus boys are often from a young age rewarded for being determined and having drive. So it's really ingrained from a young age, this beauty part, because especially because girls experience social sifting and judgment related to how beautiful they are from a young age in school and in media. All these magazines, Instagram, like all the social media that we're seeing. And it's funny because I used to be like this too, actually. And in some ways, a lot of the time I still am this way, but for a couple of years I went like on an absolutely like no carb, no dairy diet because I realized my body doesn't need it. I lost a ton of weight. I basically had the body of like a Victoria's Secret model. And I noticed the social sifting where I walk by, heads would turn, people were like, and I'd get approached so much on the street. But I realized it's not healthy. And a lot of like models actually, they don't have menstrual cycles actually. They're very, very unhealthy. Even when you go on YouTube and there's some like models that I do follow their diets and so forth, they really aren't able to have kids. They're facing infertility issues when they're trying to have kids, or they realize that they haven't had a period for like 4 years because they're under eating or they're just not eating the right things. And so it's sad to me that in the media, these women who are considered like they're considered beautiful, they're very prized by the media, and we're taught this from a young age to look like that when really their lives are not perfect, and they're not a symbol of health. So it's really sad, but it's very true. And there's a lot of research behind the conditioning, the social conditioning that happens. It also happens also with like how we are taught to believe in ourselves. So women are kind of told, you're not good at math. Like they're kind of told this in their heads when they're young because they aren't valued for intelligence as much as they are valued for beauty. It's important to marry well. That's something that a lot of girls are told as at a young age because they're not expected to become breadwinners later on in their lives. So there's a lot of research around math tests, for example. Women and men actually, girls and boys actually perform relatively equal in math tests. But then when they have a box, like a question before the math test that says, please indicate your gender, female or male. The females, when they indicate female before performing a math test, actually perform worse than men do because they've ingrained their social psyche that women are not meant to be doing math or engineering roles. So that's also another lead up into why it's affecting girls going into STEM, for example, is because of the systemic social conditioning that happens at a young age.
And we have heard about how you got into this topic, how you started writing, and some of the, or at least one case study, the CEO of Tacha, Vicky. And can you tell us who is the book for?
Yeah, the book is for, I think there's three different audiences the book is for. One is for the investor who wants to invest in diversity because diversity is actually highly profitable. There's high ROI in investing in women, actually, and they do perform at least 10 times. 10% higher. It is the female-led startups perform have a higher ROI of 10% versus the male-led startups. I think the second one is really for the communities, like government legislators or educators who want to support DEI, or leaders in companies who just want to, figure out, what are ways that I can implement, diversity, equity, and inclusion policies into my company to help support minorities, get more creativity into our company, because it is proven that higher degree of diversity actually breeds higher creativity and a greater increase in innovation revenue by companies when they have more diverse teams. And the third audience is really for the minority woman, any minority, actually, honestly, because a lot of these stories are about minorities that has ever dreamed of becoming an entrepreneur, and understanding that you don't have to hold yourself back from it. And a lot of the times, yes, there are external barriers, there are external systemic issues that we face when we go out into the world. But a part of it is also in ourselves, and how can we overcome ourselves? So, yeah, those are the three audiences that I'm hoping will pick up the book and read it.
Yeah. I was gonna say mothers, right? Or even parents, right? Not just like minority parents, not just like parents of daughters, but I think, I mean, I've not read your book yet. I soon will when it's out. But I mean, now that I'm a father of two boys, I also think that I think some of this are just some of the things you mentioned so far can be very subconscious, right? We grew up with all these cultural nuances, like what you said about STEM and all that. Yeah, like policemen, we don't think about women fighting fire and being yeah, and catching thieves. So I think I also want to be a parent that don't want to carry on such biases carried from my parents or from society. So I think, yeah, I think as a parent, I think it's also worth reading to know what are kind of struggles that women, be it structurally or culturally, have put themselves under. Yeah, so this just wanna add on to that.
Yeah, and actually, there's research behind that where, especially in investors, actually, there's a higher degree of investment in female-led startups from investors who have daughters. It's so fascinating. It's and I think it's a lot of it is they start to relate and they start to see, "Oh my gosh, my daughter's facing all these barriers. I'd love her to become like me as a man." But I realized it's so much harder for her. People are telling her that she needs to be more beautiful than smart, for example. Or like, when she's speaking in front of her classroom, she's always getting interrupted.
Yeah.
And so this happened to me when I was in MBA school. I was heavily influenced by a professor, a male professor, who, for the first time, like he was just so educated about gender issues. And I didn't know any of this stuff before. I didn't know about this thing called man interrupting, where men interrupt women but more often than they interrupt men, actually. And so in the classroom, the professor would actually call on men and women equally. And that was new to me because typically it's like 90% of the time they call on men. And because also men can be a bit more aggressive or like, or they might say assertive in putting up their hands. But also, whenever I got interrupted or a woman would get interrupted, he'd stop the person who was interrupting this woman, and then he would let the woman continue. And I was like, oh, wow, that's what it's like. Like, it happens. And I didn't even realize that I was getting interrupted so often. So, yeah, so I think daughters have an amazing impact on fathers in changing their behaviors in the workforce, in investing more in women, and also getting more women into the companies because they realize, there are a lot of systemic barriers that women face in the workforce. One example is in MBA school, only one third of students are women, and I think it's only something like less than 10% or of applicants are women, actually. So they really try to get it to 50-50, but what they realize is that women are often not getting promoted at the same level of men. And so and I've already shared this before about this whole broken rung of women and minority women not being promoted at the same rate as male of what Caucasian males are. But then there's also the factor of maternity as well. So when women are going to MBA school, it's around the time that they're thinking about parenthood because they do have a bit of a biological clock, right? And also within, the workforce, women have a tougher time changing jobs than men do, because when you become pregnant, if you go on maternity, it's basically a 2-year journey. The first year is basically you're getting pregnant and you're basically exhausted all the time. You have like your hormones are all over the place. You're hyper emotional. You need to sleep. And a lot of the time you're keeping this quiet. And you might be like, throwing up in the morning a lot too. So you just feel sick and like crap for the first year. The second year, you're breastfeeding the whole time, and you're not sleeping. And because you're feeding and the baby needs to like, feed every 2 to 3 hours, you're not sleeping. It's really impossible to work at times, right? So women have a difficult time switching jobs as well versus men. They have to think about this whole 2-year journey. And sometimes you can't, especially like we're seeing infertility rates here in Singapore and also around the world. Fertility is declining everywhere. And so this really affects a woman's ability to get promoted, for example, because people don't really want to promote someone or put someone into a role when they're pregnant or they're about to get pregnant. And it's a 2-year journey, so they have to wait 2 years before they can, like, get promoted or switch jobs or whatever because they just aren't feeling great overall. They're basically a human cow, in some respects. Yeah, so it's really sad because there are so many issues that are causing women to not be able to progress in the workplace, and many men don't realize these issues until they become fathers.
Yeah. What do you think? How has this remote or hybrid work arrangements helping in this situation?
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
think
I'll give some example, right? I
Mhm.
mean, what I read is that this hybrid or remote working situation is actually beneficial because, or at least in the height of the pandemic, everyone's working from home and everyone's like doing work calls via Zoom, and it's harder to get interrupted, right? When you are on Zoom versus in person, maybe men just talk over women, right, in meetings, or maybe you got to be standing at the back, you're not even visible, right, to the leaders in a situation and in person. And I think in terms of like remote work, I think what matters most is your performance, the outcome, versus like being seen and being heard, which could be an issue for the minorities in the workplace. So this is what I read. But of course, then it's a bit tricky now that we're now going back to the pre-pandemic world where there's hybrid arrangements or some companies are insisting that everyone goes back to work in person. Then there's also a cultural change, right, in mentality. But what's your take on this?
Yeah, I think there's 3 kind of areas that I'd love to share about, like, topics around this that affect women in general. One is that during COVID, a lot of women were getting laid off at a faster rate than men were because women work in the service industries more than men do, like hospitality or retail. So women were actually way more faced with this whole like COVID issue. And that actually in my book, like I share a bit more about that. It actually pushed women into entrepreneurship a bit more because they needed to find a way to sustain themselves. Secondly, is with caretaking as well. During COVID, women, it was really hard. A lot of women just left their jobs to take care of their kids because their kids were like, they had to homeschool their kids now. And so that was actually negative towards women. And then the third part is FaceTime as well. So if you're in a hybrid situation where some you can choose to go to the office, it's actually very tough if a lot of the people who can go to the office are going to the office, but if you're taking on a lot of domestic duties and you need to be home, it really affects your ability to progress in the organization if other people are in the office and you're not in the office and having that face time. So I think all those 3 factors of like, the higher degree of layoff, the caretaking, and the face time has hurt women a lot. And it's pushed women back in the workforce. I think the point that you're trying to make is the flexibility. And actually, a lot of women love this flexibility now. If roles are all equal and everyone only goes into the office 2 days a week or not at all, it does make a big impact. Women really enjoy that. And they are looking for that flexibility to be able to, like have they don't have to commute anymore to work, or they can still pick up their kids and then come back home and like work from home. So, and like you said, with meetings, they can be present at the meetings if everyone else is in an equal setting of the virtual space. So I think it really depends on whether like it's equality of everyone doing the same thing, of half in the office, half at home, that kind of thing, or whether it's everyone is remote. And I think for everyone to be remote, that really helps women.
Yeah, spot on. I work in a company where it's 100% remote, it's 100% work from home. And I've also read,
Mhm,
as the world comes back to the physical world post pandemic, I've also read that companies are also very conscious about like making sure that there's no unfair advantage to those who can actually come back to the office, because there's this proximity bias, right? That the leaders may end up promoting the employees who are always in office because they can,
mhm,
and that hurts those employees who can't. So, and that's why when I speak with friends who are different companies, I asked like, and they were weirded out. I mean, they thought it was a weird question, right? Like when I asked them, like, does the company ensure that the choice of days to come back to office is it the same for everyone in the team, or could people choose?
mhm,
Because if people choose, then it could be tricky, right? That if you happen to be in office more often with the boss, that might give you that proximity bias. But if it's been said that it's going to be, let's say, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, then it's very fair, right? Everyone's supposed to be in office on these 3 days, right? So
mhm.
this is some of my thoughts. I've got maybe two last questions for you. Number one is that I know your book is about East Asian women and entrepreneurship. I just want to ask, one, what's one lesson from the book that you can impart to the audience who is who is thinking about career change into the corporate world and not necessarily going to be an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I think one major lesson that I've learned through this is that fr- from these stories and the people that I've profiled, is that everyone faces ups and downs in life. And I'm going to just share my favorite quote that, like, and I know, John, you know this quote because I've shared it with you before. The reason we struggle with insecurity is because we compare our behind the scenes with everyone else's highlight reel. So despite the fact that, we're always on Instagram, we see that, people are living their best lives ever. We don't see all the work, the pain, the sweat, the tears that people suffer through to get to that place. We think that they got it a lot easier. And you know what? Many of the stories that I share in my book are about this grit and perseverance. And one of them was the founder of Canva. Her name is Melanie Perkins, and she went through a journey of fundraising for 3 years. Imagine just fundraising for 3 years. You don't even have a startup yet. You're looking for looking for a tech co-founder. She was looking for investors. She learned kite surfing and would go on these kite surfing retreats just to find investors, because there's a lot of venture capitalists that like kite surfing. And she would, there was a time where her kites surf actually got caught and broke, and she had to just tread water for hours in the Caribbean, just waiting for rescue to come for her, just because she needed to fundraise. So she actually wrote a note to herself, and I hope it's okay that I kind of read this out to your audience.
Yeah, sure.
One day, one day you feel like you're on top of the world, and the next you feel like the world is on top of you. And it's kind of keeps seesawing between those things. So she shares about, the times when she was going down, and she would talk to herself about how, it's like, I can't believe, I still haven't fundraised. I've told everyone that I'm going to start this company. But I think it's the belief in the self-talk that you have, and understanding that everyone, despite the fact that, she's worth $6.5 billion now, her company has 60 million monthly active users, 500,000 paying, 5,000 teams are paying customers like Zoom or Intel. Despite all of this, she really had some down points in life, and everyone faces these points. And to realize what's important is this growth mindset of picking yourself back up.
Yeah, I use Canva. I'm very impressed by Canva. And I mean, she has a very English sounding name, but she doesn't look too Caucasian, right? What's ethnicity? Do you know?
Yeah, so I think she's mixed race, but she's like a half Malaysian or half Filipino.
Mm,
So I think like a lot of she doesn't use that towards,
Mm,
her
mm,
fundraising story at all, by the
mm.
way. She doesn't really share it as, I'm a biracial woman or I'm a minority woman. And she actually never even focuses on the fact that she's a woman at all, right? Which I think it's because you don't want to also as a, as a startup founder, you don't want to have to say invest in me because I'm a woman. You want to be known for your merits. So I think she's one very impressive founder, and I use Canva too. And it's amazing that they've been able to become profitable. They're hyper profitable, actually, and it's only because they've been able to get premium customers who help fund the freemium model, and they offer their products also their service for free to charities and nonprofits too. So she's also a big part of giving back, which is also another theme. Like she started her own foundation. She's learning how to give back and donate in a way that's sustainable for the world. And how you give back in this world, it can be tough because when you're a high profile person, you get asked a lot of
Yeah.
how to give back. But she's really trying to figure out like what is the best way, what are the causes that I really want to support most.
Yeah, if I'm not wrong, she's probably one of the youngest self-made female billionaire in the world. She's under 40. I just checked, she's like 35. And I mean, she's
Mhm.
closer to our part of the world, right? She's based in Australia. And I think
Mhm.
Canva is just hugely popular. So I'm glad you covered her story in your book. But I want to drill in this point again, right? Like, what's your take, your advice, be it from the book that you've written or outside of your personal or from your personal life? What's one lesson that you can give to the women listening to this podcast now about a career change, be it to a different industry altogether or to a different company, and not necessarily to be the founder of something, right? Not to be an entrepreneur. Yeah. Any takeaways for people for the ladies listening to the podcast on a career change?
Yeah, sure. I think for both men and women, I'd say we all think that everyone has it figured out. We think the CEO of our company or that our boss has it figured out. But honestly, everyone's going through their ups and downs, and nobody has it figured out at all. We're just going day by day and figuring it out as we go along. I think for me also, like I have started to progress into a more senior role in like in my corporate experience. And I started to realize this when I was the only woman in the room. I am often the only woman in the room in a lot of work experiences now, actually, where I sit in a room full of like 15 men, and the men don't seem to realize that like I'm the only woman, but I do because I can feel it. It's just the masculine energy and the fact that I'm like often a lot of the time facilitating these meetings. But that's when I also started to realize that I am also a role model for others, and that's how I need to behave as well. And even though I don't look like have it all together, like, with writing my book, there are many times that this book might not have happened because there was just too much going on in my life. But I realized that everything I do now, there is a bit of a spotlight on me in some ways. I'm not saying that I'm like, hyper important or whatever, but other female employees or other women who are more junior might be looking at me, and seeing how does she behave in these situations. And I've actually had women reach out to me like of all ages on LinkedIn, for example. And they would say, or they saw me speak somewhere, or they heard a podcast like this one, and they say, your message really resonated with me. And for me, it's like, oh, wow, I didn't realize people were listening to me. But I think that's something else that we have to realize. Like when I say that nobody has it figured out, it's true. Nobody has it figured out. Even if they think they have it figured out, a lot of things like, the investor might decide, let's pull out the CEO. I mean, over the week, like as we know, very recently, cryptocurrency has gone down. There's a huge cryptocurrency event that happened. Like I think it was late last year or a couple months ago. We also with the FTC. Then we also had this bank run where the Silicon Valley Bank just fell. Then because of all these rumors about the reporting of different banks, another a major Swiss bank, Credit Suisse, also went through its own, you
Yep.
know, thing going on. So nothing is ever certain in life, right? So you have to realize, you just have to roll with the punches. We don't know what's going on. We're always figuring things out as we go along. And sometimes you have to just realize you have become a role model for others and you are the protagonist in a lot of people's stories. There are many people I've written who are now protagonists in the book that I've written, and so people look to you for advice or for support, and that's when you have to realize, okay, I now need to behave as a role model. I have to do the right thing. I have to, people are looking to me for leadership at times, even if I'm not directly managing these people or I'm not responsible or accountable for these people, but people look to us, you as well as a podcaster, of how do you behave, what are you supporting, all these things. So I think that's the biggest lesson, is that nobody has it figured out. And, over time, people behave in certain ways and doing the right thing when they realize that they've become role models to others.
Yeah, I also want to highlight that in my view, you don't have to write a book about such topic. I mean, you could very well go on to your, I mean, now in your corporate roles, your job, and do other stuff, right, that you enjoy. And I just thought that the fact that you've been devoting so much of your time to write this book with a topic that I think is important, not just to investors, but also parents and even now educators, as I think about it. I feel that yeah, that's I wouldn't say noble sounds like a big word, right? I don't want to put that weight on your shoulders, but that's kudos to you, right? That you're living in a way a legacy, or at least you're living a piece of work and well researched work for others to enjoy and for others to build upon on, so that yeah, and I feel that's yeah, noble is a big word. I can't think of a better word. Yeah, I think kudos to you. You didn't have to do that, but I think what you have done with your book and with this sharing, I think it's going to inspire many other people. And I hope and I'm sure this will be the case. I was going to ask you what's a big message to the world. I think I got it very loud and clear. No one has said figured out. And now I want to come to the last part, right? Tell us more about the book, when it's going to be released. Give us more details about the book. How can someone find out more about the book? And maybe last one is that how do you want to be contacted if you want to be contacted?
Yeah, sure. Well, I just want to add before this, John, that you're also doing something similar. You're doing something very noble where you're bringing other people's vulnerable stories and having conversations with people that they wouldn't have access to, right? And you're building a platform that people around the world can have access to these stories that you are sharing, right? Messages about vulnerability, that it's okay to live your life on your own terms.
Thank
So
you.
you're also doing something very similar, and you're becoming a role model, and you're also sharing that people, you don't have to look the part. You don't have to be, you don't have to be a Caucasian male all the time who's, sharing these things. So thanks for asking about my book. The book is called You Don't Have to Look the Part: How East Asian Women Thrive as Entrepreneurs. It explores the impact of the double minority status in East Asian women, lessons about successful East Asian female entrepreneurs, and also the strengths and merits and how we can better support them as community members. So you can follow me on LinkedIn. My LinkedIn handle is Winnie Wong 41. And the book will be available on Amazon, which the link will be provided through this podcast. The ebook will be available in May 2023, and then the paperback in June 2023. So thanks so much for having me on this podcast, John. Like, I really appreciate being able to share more about these stories and reach a wider audience.
Yeah, thank you for your time. I think that you have a beautiful message, and that's why yeah. So once again, thank you, Winnie, and let's stay in touch. And I look forward to the launch of your book.
Thanks so much, John, and thanks for having me on the podcast.